It looks like the video abruptly got cut off, so let me just backtrack one slide. Glad I caught it. We'll just pick it up right where we left off. I was saying you had an alkaline tide, what they call the alkaline tide, which is referring to the secretion of HCO3 here. And I was saying on this slide, you have a physical and chemical barrier that protects the cells at pH 7 because you don't want the stomach acid to erode the stomach lining like in the stomach ulcer, which can happen actually. So the mucus layer provides a physical barrier against the stomach acid, and the bicarbonate provides a chemical acid neutralizer, which also protects the stomach lining. So at the surface, you got pH 7, but in the stomach lumen, you have a pH 2, which is effective for activating pepsinogen to pepsin, digesting things, and the HCl prevents bacterial colonization of the small intestine. Okay, we're going to move on to phase 3 here. Moving on to phase 3 of gastric secretion, the intestinal phase. I collectively call this putting on the brakes because basically it's the small intestine communicating hormonally back to the stomach. Say, hey, slow down. Just you keep your churning, but don't squeeze too much into us very much because we can't hold very much. Maybe the small intestine has a 1 inch in diameter tube. Stomach is much bigger; it can hold a lot more. So I kind of call this putting on the brakes. And the physiology is to understand the physiology of these hormones, these intestinal hormones, which has a strong digestive function. So let's go through each one. Okay, let me read what I also have in the slide. Inhibit stomach churning. As the stomach empties, you decrease stomach stretch and increase duodenal stretch, which is the first part of the small intestine. Both inhibit myenteric plexus, which is the muscle plexus. Intestinal cells of the duodenum secrete these hormones. And it kind of depends what you're squirting into the duodenum. What's in the chyme will determine which hormone is secreted because you need that hormone depending on what you eat. Now, so all of these intestinal hormones, depends what's in the chyme. Chyme itself is a trigger to release the hormone secretin. These first two hormones are the most important. They do most of the work. Chyme is a trigger for the release of the hormone secretin. Secretin does a couple of main things. It's called secretin because it makes the pancreas and liver secrete things. The liver and pancreas are your major accessory organs of digestion. Remember, an accessory organ is not in the digestive tract, but it secretes things into it to accomplish digestion. So secretin, one, it'll target the liver to increase bile production. Bile helps emulsifies fat for its digestion. Also, secretin will have, well, there's liver and there's little pancreas there. The pancreas will be stimulated by secretin to secrete a bicarb-rich juice, which will help neutralize the acid from the stomach. So I'll just call it bicarb-rich juice. Okay, that'll neutralize the stomach acid. That is the job of secretin. Just the arrival of chyme will stimulate its release. Next hormone, CCK or cholecystokinin. I just call it CCK mostly, but the full name is cholecystokinin. I actually read it out once. The presence of lipids and protein in the chyme will stimulate its release. So lipids, proteins, you're going to get your CCK. Now, if you break that word down, cholecystokinin, it basically means move bile. One of the things CCK will stimulate is gallbladder contraction. There it is right there. Filled with a concentrated bile, squeeze that, that'll help move the bile. So CCK will stim gallbladder contraction. Now, it's not enough to squeeze the gallbladder. You have to like open that spigot down here. This is the hepatopancreatic sphincter. There's a little sphincter in there. So as long as that's open, and then you squeeze here, open there, you'll move the bile into the digestive tract for fat emulsion or fat digestion because of the bile that's in the gallbladder. So along with stimulate the gallbladder, you must relax hepatopancreatic sphincter. Big long term, hepatopancreatic sphincter. Hepato means liver, pancreatic, obviously pancreas. They share that sphincter. They both use it to secrete their digestive juices right there. Relax that sphincter, contract that gallbladder, you'll move the bile. All right, so that's CCK. It also stimulates the pancreas to secrete this enzyme-rich juice. Stim pancreas to secrete, and I just call it enzyme-rich juice. Those enzymes help digest foods like proteins and starches and nucleic acids and everything. Enzymes, not bicarb like secretin. That was the neutralized acid. Bicarb is not an enzyme. This is something different. Okay, so that's all of these are actions of CCK. Those other hormones listed, I don't want to say they're less important, but I less emphasize them, but I'll mention them. GIP, gastric inhibitory peptide. Now, as the name implies, along with all these other hormones, these inhibition things, again, all of these are, well, I should say, boom, 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 boom. These first four are inhibiting stomach churning. Like I said, putting on the brakes. So this one is in the name. What I also want you to know is that GIP also is for glucose digestion. It'll help stimulate the release of insulin from the pancreas. So I should write carbs in the food you ate, in the chyme. CHO is my shorthand for carbs. That stimulates the release of GIP, gastric inhibitory peptide, which will stimulate insulin release from the pancreas. The other ones here, chyme itself will stimulate the release of vasoactive intestinal peptide, or VIP for short. So chyme itself stimulates the release of VIP. I call this the food coma hormone. It dilates intestinal blood vessels to help for absorption, and so all the blood rushes to your gut and you're tired after a meal, right? This is basically that hormone. Dilate intestinal capillaries for absorption. And the last one is the only one that doesn't have an inhibition function. If you get partially digested proteins reaching the small intestine, you'll actually get a positive feedback by this hormone gastrin. Remember, gastrin gets you more churning, more stomach juices if you're seeing that there's some undigested things reaching the intestine. So if you got undigested proteins, PROs, stimulates the release of more gastrin, intestinal gastrin. Remember, you get gastrin also from the pyloric region of the stomach. This is intestinal gastrin. It does the same thing. Get more gastric juice. And churning, for that matter. I'll just write more gastric juice. So this is the only one that is has a positive feedback to get more juice. All the other ones, you should note, boom, 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 boom. They're noted here. GIP, CCK, secretin, they all have negative feedback. So I'll write that on the board. So these three are listed. I'll just list these four since I talked about all four of them. Remember, these two are the main ones, but also GIP, VIP, all inhibit gastric juice secretion and churning. And let's move on. We're already at the duodenum, talking about the duodenal phase. But that kind of finishes the three phases of gastric juice secretion and stomach churning. And when you move on to the duodenum, as we've been talking about, you got all those hormones. We teach it in 4 parts, but basically I'm not going to teach them. I'll just emphasize that second part, the D2. Notice how the stomach was intraperitoneal, and in this picture here, you've removed the stomach. So let's think about where you got to cut to remove the stomach for this dissection picture. Cut in 2 places. Cut here, that's where the esophagus is. The stomach fills this space. Cut there. That's kind of like where endostomach beginning of the duodenum is. This first part goes retroperitoneal, and then there's the duodenum, and this part pops out here and goes back to intraperitoneal. I think you'll see as we move along the digestive tract, it kind of goes intraperitoneal, then it goes back to retro, then intra, retro, intra, retro. So make a note to yourself if you want. The stomach is in the body cavity, intraperitoneal. The duodenum goes retroperitoneal, as you can see right here. That D2 part, I'm not going to ask you to identify the parts, just duodenum. Anyways, note that hepatopancreatic ampulla. I said it has, that is the ampulla that has the sphincter that is relaxed by CCK. So D2 has the hepatopancreatic sphincter. Sphincter is smooth muscle that puckers shut. You relax it, it opens up. Remember, sphincters pucker. That's normally what they do to keep things closed. So you have a hepatopancreatic sphincter. You had a pyloric sphincter in the stomach, right? They're all sphincters. This is also called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Sometimes books call it the major duodenal papilla because it's kind of nipple shaped. Sometimes it is called duodenal papilla. So let me write those terms. Sometimes it's called major duodenal papilla. or sometimes it's just called duodenal papilla, hence I put the major in parentheses. Well, anyways, these are all different ways of saying the same thing. That D2 has that papilla because that is where the liver, pancreas secretions use to squirt their digestive juices into the digestive tract, into this part of the duodenum. So that's why I've noted it for you. There's some other pictures of duodenum. In this picture here, we see the duodenum there. We see the transverse colon cut away so you get a better view of the duodenum. We also see tail of pancreas, head of pancreas nestled in with this kind of C-shaped duodenum. In this picture here, you got the duodenum. Where they cut here, that's where they cut away the end of the stomach. Where they cut here is the next part of the small intestine. This is the juncture between the jejunum, duodenum juncture. So the small intestine is one tube, but it's divided into three parts. The first 10 inches is the duodenum. Then the next 21 feet or so is jejunum ileum. So the small intestine goes duodenum, about the first 10 inches, then right into jejunum, then right into ileum, the three parts of the small intestine. So this will be the end of the duodenum, beginning of jejunum. Then they cut away, and you can see how they left the mesentery that attaches it to the back body wall. You go all the way to that end here. When you get to the end there, that's the end of ileum. Okay, so that's the beginning of jejunum, end of ileum, basically. Okay, here they completely removed it. You can think of the small intestine as being like a 21-foot long python. Put that python in a cloth bag and then gather up the cloth bag. So in my analogy here, the cloth bag is like the mesentery, and where you gather up the cloth bag is it's what's called the root of the mesentery, shown here. You gather up the cloth bag, you cut away the snake, but you gather it up and attach it to the back body wall. That's the root of the mesentery. In this picture here, they cut at the root of the mesentery right there. Here they didn't cut it, so you can kind of see. They just cut away the small intestine or the python. So you should know that the small intestine has three parts, and it's held in by root of the mesentery, shown here, shown cut away right there. So I'll kind of squeeze it in at the bottom. No, root of the mesentery. It's holding in the small intestine in place. Moving on, in this picture here, we have the duodenum here that we saw previously. Here they kind of cut it away. You got the outermost layer of the GI tract wall, the serosa. Then you have your two layers of muscularis externa. You start to see submucosa, mucosa right there. Now, on the inside of the mucosa here, we can see we have these circular folds. So it's kind of like at the end of the stomach, you have the longitudinal folds called the rugae. So here's my stomach, right? Kind of narrows to the duodenum. And the longitudinal folds run in this orientation. They're called rugae. But when you get into the small intestine, they're kind of like circular. Right? And those circular folds are called the plica circularis. I call them plica for short. But they're circular folds. Okay, plica circularis means circular folds, basically. And the reason why that's important is, remember, you have a sphincter right there. Here's our pyloric sphincter. and food sloshes back and forth, and you squirt just a little bit, 3 mils at a time. When that chyme gets to a circular surface, it has to spiral around the plica. So that slows the flow of the chyme, and it increases the contact to the mucosal surface for more efficient digestion, basically. So just spiral around the circular folds there. And remember, this is where you get your major duodenal papilla, which has that sphincter inside it. So I'll kind of draw it this way. Use a different color here. How about I draw it right in here, our major duodenal papilla. Right there. And it's shared by bile duct, pancreatic duct. There's bile duct. Going to carry bile from the gallbladder, biliary system to the duodenum. Go through that later. Here's the main pancreatic duct. So all that bicarbonate enzyme-rich juice can get into the GI tract. So that duct and that duct share a major duodenal papilla. Also note from this picture here, it's cut off and it's too much to squeeze onto my picture. That's the superior mesenteric artery and vein. They go over the duodenum. That's the anatomy I want you to know. Superior mesenteric artery and vein, they go over the duodenum. That'll be a clue to help you distinguish it from inferior mesenteric artery. So let's note. I'll just squeeze it on this slide here. Superior mesenteric A and V go over the duodenum. That's a clue to help you identify it. I'll tell you what it supplies blood to later on. Basically, it's most of the intestine. Continue on with the next slide. More superior mesenteric artery, SMA, more pictures. In this picture here we see the large intestine, which I'll get to, ascending, descending colon. There's the duodenum. Because we have these two blood vessels going over the duodenum, I know it's this blood vessel right here going over the duodenum. I know it's the superior mesenteric artery, just like this one. And to orient you with this slide, we're kind of looking at a posterior view. Here's the colon. Here's a posterior view of the duodenum. So that's the superior mesenteric artery and vein, number 16 and 28 on that figure. In this figure of the stomach, there's our longitudinal rugae. There's our circular folds, the plica. There's chyme spiraling around the plica. Here is our blood vessels going over the duodenum, superior mesenteric artery and vein. Let's talk about blood supply to this region by the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk is the first branch coming off abdominal aorta at around the level of T12. The celiac trunk is one of three singular branches coming off the abdominal aorta. It goes celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, inferior mesenteric artery. So in this picture here, pointing to the top one, celiac trunk, first branch coming off, the second branch coming off ought to be superior mesenteric artery. Okay, although it's not labeled here. Okay, so this branch, first three branches coming off, celiac trunk, singular branch. This singular branch coming off, superior mesenteric artery. This singular branch coming off, inferior mesenteric artery. Let's just focus on celiac trunk for now. Coming off, the first thing to come off the abdominal aorta. Up here, thoracic aorta. The name changes when you go through that hiatus. Now you call it abdominal aorta. So here's ab aorta. And the first branch coming off of it, I'll label it number 1. Celiac trunk. You can see it's going to give off many branches. Some go off to the right, some go off to the left. Sorry, my thing got turned off. Here it goes. So in this picture here, we can see celiac trunk right there. Some go off to the left, some go off to the right. This one coming up, going off to the left, following the lesser curvature of the stomach, is the left gastric artery coming off the celiac trunk. So here's our number 1, celiac trunk. So this first branch coming off, going up and off to the left. I'm going to call this branch number 2, left gastric artery, following the lesser curvature. Another branch, a big branch going off to the left, is the splenic artery. It's kind of hidden by the stomach. Cut away the stomach, get a full view of the splenic artery, and you can see the splenic vein with it. I'll just draw the artery. I'm using black, but I'm drawing all the arteries. Here's splenic artery, goes to the spleen. Call it number 3. Splenic artery. Going back to my previous slide here, you have this big branch going off to the right. It's going to be the common hepatic artery. Now, whenever you see an artery called common, you know it's going to branch into a bunch of things. And so this is true too. So this branch, I'm going to draw a big branch going off to the right. How about we call it number 4? Common hepatic artery. Number 4. You know, the first branch it gives off is going to go down to the duodenum and the stomach. It's called gastroduodenal artery. So let's call it that. So I'm just going to draw a little branch coming off this way. And we'll come back to it. Okay. Because if you follow this picture, there's another branch coming off, and it's called the right gastric. So to continue on my picture, wait, first let me label this one. Sorry, I'm going too fast. This is number 5. Gastroduodenal artery. Then the next branch coming off is the right gastric artery. It'll form an arterial anastomosis with the left gastric artery. You just kind of form a circle there. There you go. Call this number 6, right gastric artery. Okay, and that common hepatic will continue on and go to the liver, and you just call it proper hepatic artery or just hepatic artery. That one right there. It's going to the liver. So that one right there, let's call it number 7. Proper. So I'm going to put that in parentheses. Sometimes they drop the proper. You can call it proper hepatic artery or just hepatic artery, and people know what you mean. It's the artery supplying oxygen-rich blood to the liver. Okay. So let me take a picture of what I have so far. I'm going to have to erase my list of terms here. And continuing on with, let's go down here. Let's follow gastroduodenal artery down. It's going to give a branch right there to follow the greater curvature of the stomach. Following number 5 down, gastroduodenal. It's going to give a branch, say right there. It's going to follow the greater curvature of the stomach. We're on number 8. That branch right there. That is the right gastroomental artery. It's going to form an arterial anastomosis with a branch off the splenic artery. Draw a little branch right there. So that branch coming off there, call it number 9. That's the left gastroomental artery. And that kind of completes it. Those are all the branches of the celiac trunk I would like you to know. So there's our unlabeled picture so you can get a full view of the splenic artery. Here's a side-by-side. Here's a closer-up view. And let's review. If you want to quit yourself, turn the sound off. Abdominal aorta, celiac trunk. This first branch coming off, left gastric artery, splenic artery, common hepatic artery, first branch coming off, gastroduodenal, right gastric artery, proper hepatic artery. Moving on, here are some labeled so you can study, right? Because I gave it to you unlabeled at first, but this is fully labeled and this picture is fully labeled. That should be enough for you in addition to your lecture notes. Let's move on to the pancreas. Talk about some things we didn't mention before. It's just a soft gland, not very big. It's behind the stomach, as I said before. It has both endocrine and exocrine. We focus on the exocrine function in digestion, but I did mention the hormone insulin earlier. So these exocrine secretions, we call the pancreatic juice, and it enters through the main pancreatic duct, or just pancreatic duct. Its shape resembles an inverted tobacco pipe. Well, it doesn't look like that here, but here's the picture we were looking at, and there's the main pancreatic duct dissected away so you could see it in white there. And when we talk about the pancreatic juice, again, we subdivided. That juice is about, some of it is bicarb and some of it is enzymes, basically. So the exocrine function of the pancreas is what we like to talk about. The juice is a mix of bicarb, HCO3, right, as well as enzymes. It's about 1,200 to 1,500 ml daily. It's mostly water with our bicarb and our enzymes. Here's all of them listed: the proteases, the amylases, the lipases, the nucleases. And just as an example of how the enzymes work, I use proteases just as an example, but it works the same for all of these. And here's what I like to show. The basic idea here is to secrete in an inactive form so you don't auto-digest on the way out, right? You only activate until you get to the intestinal lumen, right? So secrete the pancreatic enzymes in an inactive form, say trypsinogen, an inactive protease, secrete enzyme in an inactive form. So the example I want to give are proteases, trypsinogen, an inactive protease. But once it gets to the lumen, then you can activate it, and it's activated by a membrane-bound enteropeptidase. Emphasize on membrane-bound. It's inside the membrane of the lumen, so you don't pre-activate it, prematurely activate it, I should say. Okay, so this is inactive. It's activated by membrane-bound enteropeptidase. And it'll convert it to an active trypsin. It is now active. And then notice how trypsin will activate other proteases. In the lumen. So that's the idea with that slide. Secrete in an inactive form and activate your pancreatic enzymes in the lumen where you want digestion to occur. So let's go back and be reminded of how secretin and CCK stimulate the pancreas. And let's kind of get to the details here by studying this structure, which are showing you kind of the acinous structure of the exocrine pancreas. So what we got here, distinguished duct cells, colored in blue, to these acinar cells, forming, acinar is like this mushroom-shaped bulb. So I'll use red and blue since that's what I have handy here. So got duct cells. Epithelial-like cells, whereas those are the duct cells, and then these acinar cells like this. It's important to distinguish duct from acinar cells because, well, secretin is released in response to the acid. So you have acid in the chyme, as you always will. That'll be the stimulus for the release of secretin from the intestine. You want to neutralize that acid. So basically you stimulate those cells to secrete your bicarb-rich juice. That'll help neutralize that acid right there, right? The other thing I have here is that CCK is released in response to, among other things, fat. Fat in your food tastes good. So you got the fat in the food you ate. You got to digest that, don't you? That digestion, that'll stimulate the release of cholecystokinin. It'll help move the bile in the gallbladder there. But here in this picture, it'll stimulate the acinar cells right there. And they'll secrete the enzyme-rich juice, including the lipases. That will help balance the fat digestion. So in this slide, I just simply show how you balance fat digestion with the enzyme-rich juice. And you balance you neutralize the acid with the bicarb-rich juice by the secretin there. You get the acid neutralization. Let's not forget about GIP. So you got the secretin, the CCK, and also that's for exocrine function, goes to the main pancreatic duct, but GIP, which I also mentioned, I'll mention it here. Remember, you have outside the acinar structure, you have the little pancreatic islets, the islets of Langerhans, if you remember that from the first unit. So maybe they're like here, little pancreatic islets. They have the endocrine function. And if you have, say, glucose and you release GIP, GIP will stimulate the islets to release insulin. So that's what I'm reminding you in this slide there, that you'll get the endocrine function of insulin to skeletal and adipose tissues to take up the glucose, take up the carb.